The glowing numerals on the smart display were the exact coordinates of my descent into calculated madness. It wasn't the late hour, 3:17 a.m., that froze the blood in my veins. It was the detailed activity log displayed next to Julian's avatar on the shared home hub screen. He had meticulously hidden his phone, silenced his notifications, and scrubbed his browsing history, but he had forgotten the one thing that tracked him with surgical precision: his high-end, military-grade fitness watch, synced directly to the home's main server for optimizing his sleep analytics. Julian claimed to be working late at the corporate downtown tower, but the watch recorded a 45-minute high-intensity cardiovascular event at a location 14 miles away from his supposed office, followed by 4 hours of minimal movement inside a multi-story residential building located precisely at 40.7892 degrees north, 73.9698 degrees west. That address belonged to the newly erected luxury condos known as the Vanguard, an address I recognized because I had briefly looked at buying a unit there before Julian vetoed the idea, citing the astronomical HOA fees. The immediate, searing pain of discovery lasted less than 3 seconds. It was replaced by a cold, frightening clarity, the kind of stillness that precedes a hurricane. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even wake him up, though he was snoring softly beside me, smelling faintly of expensive perfume that wasn't mine and a type of cheap liquor he usually avoided. I didn't want the messy theatrics of a confrontation. Confrontation grants the cheater power, the power to deny, to negotiate, to apologize, to manipulate the narrative. I wanted none of that. I wanted control, absolute and devastating. I realized Julian hadn't just cheated on me, he had violated the sanctity of our shared reality, the meticulously constructed comfort we called marriage. If he could create a false reality to protect his lies, then I would create an even more intricate, inescapable false reality designed solely to punish him. The revenge would not be financial, though I would take everything. The revenge would be purely psychological. He needed to feel the slow, agonizing erosion of trust, the gnawing suspicion that drives a person mad, the exact emotional trauma he had carelessly inflicted upon me, multiplied tenfold. In that moment, watching the digital timestamp of his betrayal flash on the screen, Clara vanished, and the architect of Julian's ruin was born. I spent the rest of the night, not mourning, but planning. The first step was invisibility, removing any trace that I knew. The second step was planting seeds of doubt that would grow into forests of paranoia, making him question his own sanity, his perception, and ultimately, his control over me. This was not merely about infidelity, this was a war for psychological supremacy, and I was about to unleash the ultimate gaslight. The first week was dedicated entirely to establishing a new baseline of behavior, a carefully calibrated neutrality that would make the future shifts seem shocking and deeply suspicious. Julian was accustomed to a certain level of wifely engagement, demanding to know his schedule, reminding him of appointments, and showing faint annoyance when he was late. I eliminated all of it. I became profoundly, unnervingly indifferent. When he called to say he was delayed, undoubtedly coming from the Vanguard, I simply replied, "Okay," and immediately hung up, often while he was still talking. This lack of reaction was the first fissure in his confidence. He expected panic or anger, my serene detachment was confusing. It suggested my focus had shifted elsewhere, to something far more engaging than monitoring his pathetic escapades. Simultaneously, I began the meticulous process of planting digital ghosts. I created a separate, completely anonymous email address using a VPN and registered it under a highly common mail name, Arthur Davies. This address was used only for subscription signups for hyperniche, high-end magazines Julian would never read, luxury watch connoisseurship, vintage motorcycle restoration, bespoke tailoring, all delivered digitally. I ensured that occasional, Fleeting notifications about these subscriptions would flash momentarily across our shared living room tablet screen, strategically timed for when Julian was distracted, guaranteeing he would see the title, but not the contents, nor the fact that the subscription was registered to Arthur Davies. I also took inventory of every piece of my existing wardrobe, identifying items Julian loathed or had grown accustomed to seeing in specific contexts, and retired them, replacing them with entirely new pieces. The replacement items were chosen not for my own taste, but for their ability to project an image of secretive, thriving independence, sharp silhouettes, colors I never wore, and a significant amount of tailored cashmere, pieces that suggested wealth, mystery, and a professional life far removed from our mutual social circle. I started carrying a small, elegant leather briefcase to work, instead of my usual shoulder tote. The briefcase was merely a prop, containing only a paperback novel and a tin of mints, but it signaled a sudden, necessary professionalization of my life, implying secret meetings, crucial documents, and late-night consultations. Julian, a creature of habit, noticed the smallest physical changes instantly, but every time he asked, "New bag?" I offered the simplest, most impenetrable answer, "Needed a change." His attempts at light-hearted probing met a brick wall of polite, unreadable silence. The silence, I discovered, was a far more potent weapon than any accusation. It forced him to fill the void with his own rising suspicion. The real work was internal, maintaining the icy facade of utter boredom regarding his existence. Every time he touched me, I had to suppress the urge to recoil, replacing it with a distant, almost pitying look. I was no longer his wife, I was a surveillance operator, and he was the rapidly deteriorating subject of my intricate, psychological experiment. Phase 1, which I internally labeled the seed drop, commenced with technology. I bought a cheap, prepaid burner phone, not traceable to me, paid for in cash far outside our neighborhood, and used it for one purpose only, sending timed, delayed text messages to my primary phone. These messages were deliberately vague, emotionally resonant, and utterly deniable. The first message appeared at 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday, while Julian was scrolling mindlessly through news headlines. It simply read, "Tonight was breathtaking. I can't wait for Saturday." I left my phone face up on the kitchen counter, ensuring the screen illuminated with the notification. When Julian inevitably glanced over, because paranoia makes even the most entitled person a nervous wreck, he saw the message. He waited 5 minutes, clearing his throat awkwardly before asking, "Who was that? A client?" I looked at the phone, picked it up with a shrug, and replied, "Wrong number, probably." Happens all the time, and deleted it without even reading the full message or showing him the sender. The sheer casualness of my lie, backed by the quick deletion, suggested not panic, but competence. I was erasing a minor operational oversight, not hiding a devastating secret. The following day, I wore a scarf with a faint, exotic scent I'd purchased specifically for this purpose, a sandalwood and amber blend that was masculine and definitely not Julian's familiar, sterile scent. I told him I had spilled some expensive boutique candle oil on myself at the office. He leaned in, sniffing dramatically, and commented, "It's strong. Smells like, I don't know, old leather and expensive regret." I simply smiled mysteriously and said, "Maybe that's the smell of a profitable contract coming through, darling." Later that week, I insured a small, almost microscopic smudge of unfamiliar deep red lipstick, purchased at a drugstore miles away, was visible on the inside of my collar, hidden unless the garment was closely examined. I left the sweater draped over a chair, knowing Julian, now fully activated as an amateur detective, would eventually pick it up under the pretense of tidying. The core strategy here was to never offer a concrete lie, only plausible deniability. If he asked about the scent, I had the candle oil story. If he asked about the text, it was a wrong number. But the sheer accumulation of these minor, bizarre anomalies began to chip away at the foundation of his certainty. He started experiencing microaggressions of doubt. A tiny receipt for 2 expensive martinis found crumpled in the bottom of my purse. I claimed it was a colleague's business expense. A faint, almost invisible scratch on the surface of my wedding band. I said I hid it on a desk drawer. Julian wasn't confronting me with confidence. He was asking questions with the nervous tremor of someone who knew the world was shifting beneath their feet but couldn't identify the epicenter. The most telling change was his own behavior. Julian began checking his own phone constantly, ensuring his notifications were on, trying to show me that he was available, he was present. He was attempting to reverse the dynamic, seeking reassurance from the very person he suspected. The process moved into active fabrication, creating physical evidence too compelling to dismiss as coincidence. Julian had always been obsessed with my career, mainly because it was steady and predictable. I weaponized that predictability. I manufactured a fictional investor named Arthur Thompson, the full name now used in carefully crafted, fake professional emails sent from my second work account to my main one. These emails contained vague references to off-site consultations and private meetings regarding capital allocation. I deliberately left one of these emails open on my laptop screen one morning, then claimed I had to rush out for an emergency dentist appointment. When I returned 2 hours later, Julian was suspiciously tidying the charging cables near my laptop. I knew he had read it. I didn't mention it, but I started answering my personal phone in hushed, serious tones, using highly technical jargon I had quickly researched about equity swaps and portfolio diversification. I ensured these calls only happened when Julian was in the vicinity. To truly solidify Arthur's reality, I invested heavily in the props. I visited a high-end stationery shop and purchased personalized note cards, thick cream stock with a slightly embossed initial A, and a distinctive fountain pen. I used these to write highly formal, very brief thank you notes to myself, referencing successful meetings and future collaborative opportunities, always signing them with a strong, unfamiliar male signature. I would leave one of these notes carelessly tucked into a folder in my briefcase, knowing his curiosity would eventually force him to trespass into my things. Julian was now installing spyware. I had predicted this. Entitlement always leads to invasive measures. I knew he had access to my primary work tablet, which I now used exclusively as a honey trap. On it, I set up a mock messaging app, populated with pre-written, ambiguous messages between Clara and a contact simply labeled A. The messages were never explicit, but suggested increasing emotional intimacy. I needed that talk tonight. A. You always know how to calm the storm, or, the blue tie suits you better than the gray. See you soon. I made sure to use vocabulary, like calm the storm, that was completely unlike my own natural speech patterns, cementing the idea that this relationship was transforming me, elevating me beyond Julian's influence. The final piece of physical evidence was an extremely expensive, yet discreet, antique silver pocket watch I purchased. I wrapped it carefully, sealed it in a small, elegant box, and buried it deep inside a drawer in Julian's sock dresser, wrapped in tissue paper that carried the same sandalwood and amber scent. I knew he would eventually look there, convinced I was hiding something in his drawers to implicate him. When he found the gift, he wouldn't know if it was a gift from him, a gift for him that I never gave, or a gift from Arthur that I was hiding in the safest place I knew. The inherent ambiguity was the engine of his escalating panic. The atmosphere in our home had transformed from cold indifference to stifling, palpable tension. Julian's sleep schedule was ruined. He woke up frequently, checking the time on his phone, then glancing across the room at me with searching, desperate eyes. He was losing weight, and the perpetual frown etched into his forehead made him look a decade older. He stopped taking his own late-night work calls, preferring to stay home and monitor me, demonstrating the classic paradox of the suspected cheater. They desperately want the spouse to be faithful, not out of love, but because their partner's betrayal would invalidate their own sacrifice of marital fidelity. One evening, after I claimed to be having dinner with a female friend, I was actually alone in a quiet cafe reading a book. I returned home to find Julian pacing in the hallway, looking frantic. He immediately launched into a tirade about a weekend trip receipt he had found. The receipt, which I had painstakingly fabricated using software, was for 2 nights at a boutique hotel several towns over, registered under the pseudonym C. Ashworth, a subtle nod to the fake investor Arthur. The price was exorbitant, hinting at high-stakes extravagance. "Where were you going, Clara? Who is Ashworth?" "I saw the date. It's next weekend." His voice cracked with genuine distress. He wasn't acting, he was suffering the full, brutal force of the fear of abandonment and the insult of perceived betrayal. I simply stared at him, my expression unreadable, letting him hang in the emotional air for a painfully long minute. Then, I lowered my voice, adopting a tone of wounded, maternal disappointment. "Julian, you are highly stressed. I keep telling you to manage your workload. You need to relax." I walked past him, heading toward the staircase. He grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly tight. "Don't deflect. Tell me what this is." Is this Arthur?" I pulled my arm away gently, maintaining eye contact. "Arthur Thompson is an investor, Julian. He is very important to my career. Do you honestly believe I would jeopardize everything for a cheap weekend away? What is wrong with you? Why are you searching my things? Is this how little you trust me?" The genius of the gaslight is not the lie itself, but turning the accusation back onto the accuser, making their search for truth the symptom of their own mental instability. He immediately recoiled, his face collapsing into shame. I just worry about us, Clara. Things have been strange." He was begging me to reassure him, to tell him he was crazy, to pull him back from the brink of paranoia. I refused that comfort. "If you were truly worried about us, Julian, you wouldn't be inventing fantasies about weekend affairs. You would be focusing on your own health." I walked up the stairs, leaving him alone in the spotlight of his own toxic jealousy, completely forgetting that he was the real cheater. At that moment, watching him crumble into a chair, his head in his hands, I had to stop and acknowledge the ethical razor's edge I was balancing on. This level of manipulation was dangerous, perhaps even cruel, but was it any crueler than the quiet, years-long destruction he wrought on our shared life? It brings us to a moment of introspection for the audience, too. If you found out your partner was cheating, and you had the option to forego the public humiliation and instead inflict a deep, psychological reckoning that mirrored the pain they caused you, would you take that path, or is confrontation always the morally superior choice? Share your thoughts below on whether emotional revenge, disguised as self-protection, is ever justified. Having established his deep-seated paranoia, the next step was to deepen the fictional narrative of Arthur Thompson beyond mere professional pretense and into genuine emotional competition. Julian needed to believe Arthur was winning not just financially, but spiritually. I began making subtle shifts in my routine that suggested a newfound zest for life unconnected to Julian. I bought a new running outfit and started going for long runs early in the morning, not at 5 a.m. when Julian was asleep, but right around 7:30 a.m., when he was in the middle of his rushed morning routine. I ensured he saw me leaving, energized and focused, but I never told him where I ran or with whom. If he asked, I merely said, "Through the park." Crucially, I started developing highly specific, new interests that were intrinsically intellectual and culturally elevated, interests Julian had always dismissed as pretentious. I began listening exclusively to classical music, Wagner and Shostakovich, which I streamed loudly enough for him to hear, but not understand, hinting at sophisticated shared tastes with my supposed new lover. I also started leaving deep, philosophical notes scattered on my desk, referencing existentialist literature I hadn't touched since college, underlining phrases about the necessity of personal liberation and breaking free from stifling expectations. These were bait, crafted to make Julian believe Arthur wasn't just a physical threat, but an intellectual superior who was opening my mind. The most effective piece of sustained psychological pressure involved the voice. Using a simple voice modulation app on my secondary tablet, I recorded a short, deep-voiced message, gravelly and cultured, saying only, "I hope the meeting went well. Text me when you're free." I deliberately played this message once on speakerphone while Julian was within earshot, ensuring he only heard the last 3 words and the masculine timbre. Before he could react, I slammed the phone down and looked frustrated. Ugh. Wrong number. People are so careless. The rapid denial, the visible frustration, it all suggested I was attempting to suppress a highly emotional, forbidden communication. Julian became obsessed with monitoring my phone usage, frequently offering to help me with my device issues, clearly angling to look at my text logs. I let him, knowing the logs were completely clean, while all communication with the Arthur persona happened either through the disposable phone, which stayed hidden in a lockbox at my office, or via highly encrypted, auto-deleting chats on a secure, untraceable platform he wouldn't even know existed. Julian began exhibiting clear signs of psychological distress, hair pulling, persistent nail biting, and an inability to focus on his work, which was now suffering badly. The irony was exquisite. His infidelity had been sloppy and careless, easily hidden behind routine lies. My fabricated affair was precise, multifaceted, and executed with cold, deliberate genius, utilizing every digital and emotional vulnerability he possessed. I was winning, not by exposing his lie, but by forcing him to inhabit a reality where he was the victim of the exact crime he committed. The emotional distance was now a chasm, and I began the phase of controlled retreat. I started arranging small, planned absences that were too short to be called abandonment, but long enough to fuel agonizing speculation. I would disappear for 4 hours on a Saturday afternoon, claiming to need to buy art supplies in a neighboring district, returning with only a bag from a generic craft store, but smelling faintly of wood smoke and old libraries, 2 scents I knew Julian associated with romantic seclusion. When he questioned me, which he now did with a desperate, pitiful tone rather than aggressive accusation, I simply sighed and looked away. "Julian, I just needed some space. I can't breathe here anymore." This declaration, though entirely unrelated to a real affair, hit him harder than any direct evidence. It suggested the marriage itself was dying, and I was making arrangements for my emotional departure. To escalate the anxiety, I initiated a series of financial maneuvers that appeared entirely legitimate on the surface, but signaled preparation for divorce. I consulted a lawyer about setting up a separate investment trust, citing tax efficiency, and then casually mentioned this conversation to Julian, framing it as a professional necessity. He immediately latched onto the subtext. "A trust? Why do we need that? Are we separating assets?" I maintained the facade of professionalism. "It's just smart business, Julian. We're reaching a point where we need better financial planning." His fear was now so overwhelming that he completely stopped challenging me on the details of Arthur. Instead, he focused entirely on surveillance, desperate to catch the single, undeniable action that would prove his suspicions correct and, ironically, restore his sanity by validating his paranoia. I decided to give him that opportunity. The final, physical trap needed to be perfect, leading him directly to a false confrontation. I booked a single night at a mid-range, anonymous business hotel across town, under the name C. Thompson. I used a prepaid card not traceable to my bank accounts. The reservation confirmation, a physical piece of paper, was printed and carefully slipped into the spine of a book I knew Julian had checked out from my bookshelf while searching for clues. The booking was for the following Friday. I didn't cancel the reservation immediately. Instead, I let it sit, a ticking bomb of undeniable physical proof. I also bought a small vial of generic, cheap men's cologne, the kind of scent that suggested fleeting, transactional intimacy, and placed it, unsealed, in my rarely used travel toiletries bag, which I left slightly ajar in the master bathroom. I wanted him to find the confirmation, find the cologne, and put together the undeniable narrative: Friday night, local hotel, cheap cologne, C. Thompson. He would believe he finally had me. He would believe he had his proof, his ticket back to the moral high ground. But I wasn't planning on being there. The discovery of the hotel confirmation detonated precisely as planned, 2 days before the scheduled date. I walked into the kitchen to find Julian standing rigidly by the breakfast bar, holding the slightly creased confirmation slip like a holy text. His hands were shaking, and his eyes were wide and red-rimmed from lack of sleep. He didn't shout, he whispered, his voice hoarse with devastated triumph. C. Thompson. Friday night. Room 402. You were going to leave me, weren't you? You were going to meet him there. His pain felt real, agonizingly real, and for a fleeting second, I felt a flicker of something akin to guilt, instantly extinguished by the memory of the GPS coordinates from his fitness watch. This was necessary. I maintained my poker face, tilting my head slightly as if evaluating a poorly phrased question. What is that, Julian? Where did you get that? I made a move to take the paper, and he snatched it away. Don't touch it. This is my proof. You can't gaslight me out of this, Clara. I knew it. I knew you were meeting someone. I let out a sharp, dramatic laugh, the kind of laugh that suggests the accuser has completely lost their mind. Julian, that is absurd. I have no idea what that is. Did you find it in the mail? Maybe it's a receipt for a colleague's trip? Are you actually accusing me, based on an anonymous printout? I walked closer, using my calm, composed energy to dominate his hysteria. I think you need serious help. You are fabricating reality, Julian. This paranoia is consuming you. I pushed the ultimate button. I started crying, but only the cold, controlled tears of wounded dignity, not heartbreak. How dare you think so little of me? I am going to call Dr. Peterson immediately. We need to talk about your recent erratic behavior. The moment I framed his accusation as a medical symptom, his resolve broke. He crumpled, clutching the paper, his belief warring desperately with the sudden, terrifying fear that he was actually experiencing a psychotic breakdown. He apologized profusely, begging me not to call the therapist, promising he would be better. I extracted a promise from him that he would take Friday night off, stay home, and focus on his mental health. My revenge required him to be exactly where I wanted him to be on Friday, home, simmering in fear. The psychological inversion was complete. The cheating husband was now desperately trying to prove his sanity to the faithful wife who he believed was slipping away, but who was, in fact, orchestrating his descent into madness with masterful precision. Friday arrived, and Julian was a wreck of nerves, hovering around the house, attempting to appear calm while subtly monitoring my every move. I acted distant, slightly hurt, but focused on my preparations for the next day, which I claimed was a tedious, all-day business seminar. I let him see me pack a small, entirely innocent overnight bag, laptop, business notes, and a sterile toiletries kit. Crucially, I left the hotel confirmation slip, which he had supposedly destroyed in his moment of guilt, in a visible but obscure location, taped to the back of a mirror in the guest bathroom. I knew he would inevitably search every corner of the house looking for further proof of his mental decline. Finding the receipt again would reignite his paranoia, leading him to believe I was going through with the meeting, perhaps thinking he had misplaced his previous attempt at destruction. At 6 p.m., I gave him a chaste kiss and left, driving my car directly to the anonymous business hotel, room 402. I did not check in, I had no intention of staying. I simply went to the designated floor, entered the code I had obtained from the booking details, since I had paid for the room, and performed the final, crucial piece of staging. I sprayed the cheap men's cologne liberally around the room, especially near the pillows and in the bathroom sink. I turned on the shower for 5 minutes, creating a slight steam, and left a single, crumpled silk napkin with a smear of deep red lipstick on the desk. I then wiped down the door handles and left, locking the room. I drove directly to an expensive spa retreat I had booked 70 miles north of the city, a place with poor cell service and an atmosphere of extreme tranquility. The goal was simple: ensure Julian was far away and unable to track me accurately, while placing him squarely in the crosshairs of the fake rendezvous. By 7:30 p.m., I was sipping herbal tea, my phone on airplane mode. Julian, I knew, wouldn't be able to resist. The confirmation slip, the cologne scent, my sudden absence, the cumulative psychological weight of weeks of gaslighting, it would be too much. He would race to the hotel, convinced he had to prove to himself, above all, that his suspicions were real. He needed the validation of betrayal to escape the terror of insanity. Around 8:45 p.m., I briefly deactivated airplane mode to check my messages. There were 6 missed calls from Julian and a hysterical, rambling text: "Clara, where are you?" "I'm here. Room 402. It's empty." "Where is he?" "Where are you?" "You did this to me. You made me feel crazy. I'm calling the police." I immediately shut my phone off, savoring the knowledge of his desperate, solitary confrontation with an empty hotel room and the ghost of Arthur Thompson. He had arrived expecting a mistress, he found only the hollow echo of his own fractured psyche. I documented the time and content of his text, filing it away as Exhibit A, proof of erratic mental state. Julian's reaction over the weekend confirmed the irreversible damage I had inflicted. When I returned late on Saturday afternoon, claiming the seminar had run long, he was a shell of a man, curled up on the sofa, seemingly unable to process the cognitive dissonance. He had clearly realized that he had stalked me to an empty hotel room, confirming my narrative that he was dangerously paranoid and unstable. He didn't confront me about the hotel. He couldn't, because doing so would validate his own mental breakdown. Instead, he begged for forgiveness. "I need you to know that I love you, Clara. I'm so sorry for my behavior. I've been awful. I need to trust you. I need to get help." He was confessing, not to cheating, but to his own paranoid delusion, handing me the key to my escape. I played the concerned, yet weary, wife perfectly. I held him, stroking his hair, but my embrace was clinical, filled with detached observation. "Of course, Julian. I accept your apology. But you have deeply hurt my feelings, and more importantly, you have jeopardized your own mental health. We need professional intervention immediately." I spent the next few days forcing him to schedule therapy sessions, making him believe this was the necessary step to save our marriage, a marriage I intended to obliterate. While he was occupied with selecting therapists and researching anti-anxiety medications, convinced he was the one who needed fixing, I began Phase 10, the meticulous compilation of his actual sins. I retrieved the initial data from the fitness tracker, cross-referencing the GPS coordinates with public records to confirm the ownership of the condo. I hired a private investigator for a single afternoon, just enough time to confirm the identity of the woman Julian was seeing, providing undeniable photographic evidence of their meetings near the Vanguard. I didn't need this evidence for emotional satisfaction, I needed it for leverage in the divorce courts. The beauty of the strategy was that Julian was so focused on recovering from the trauma of my non-existent affair that he had dropped his guard entirely regarding his own. He was desperate to prove himself a devoted husband again, throwing himself into chores, demanding family dinners, and constantly checking in on my emotional well-being, a profound reversal of the entitled arrogance he had displayed just weeks prior. His psychological energy was entirely focused inward, on his perceived pathology. He was defenseless. The preparation for the final reveal was quiet and swift. I organized the proof into a pristine, leather-bound portfolio, labeling it simply, the Vanguard dossier. The time for psychological warfare was over, it was time for the decisive strike that would end the marriage and redefine our financial futures, using his own paranoid confessions as the foundation of my strategy.